Okay, welcome everyone to our second session of the Adaptation Planning and Practices for Forest and Ecosystem Management online training. We're really happy to have all of you here today. This is, the second week of our long journey together. So it's so great to see so many folks in the room. And I've gotten a lot of emails from folks who are taking advantage of watching the recording on YouTube. So make sure if you're sick or for some reason you just can't attend, that you don't worry about it and you just go to YouTube when we send you the newsletter with a link. Okay. I'm just saying that for all the people who are listening right now on the YouTube. It's okay. But we really appreciate hearing from all of you too. Okay, next slide. Last week, we had a really awesome time meeting all of you in our discussion sessions and in lecture. So just again, just a huge reminder of all of the hands that are part of, or just a shout out to all of the folks who are part of this effort, this online training. Although you might be corresponding directly with me or Maddie and Courtney, as we're listed in so many of the contact emails, you may also have been introduced to some folks who are getting to know you. We've assigned ourselves to several of the different projects within the training. So we'll be reaching out to you to have ongoing discussions about your project throughout the training. So if you don't know about us, please go to our website and check us out. Check out the bio, get to know us, get to know our work at forestadaptation.org/team. Okay, next slide. All right, so today, session 2, today is probably one of the big subjects that you were looking forward to. I know that last week setting up goals and objectives is definitely onerous and confusing, and we saw that some of you reached out and are looking for some insight on your goals and objectives, and we're totally going to follow up with you on that. This week is the big piece, right? This is all about thinking about climate change and assessing those climate change effects on the places that we care about and the places that you've brought as part of your projects to this training. So in today's training session, today I'll go through a quick summary of all the folks who are here in the training, just so you can get that regional flavor and understand how many projects are distributed across the US and where they're coming from. And then Maddie and I will sort of take over and give you a high level overview of the different resources that we're going to plug into, that we have plugged into this training and make available to you. We'll talk about all of the different specifics that go into assessing climate change impacts and then evaluating vulnerability for your landscape. I'll run through a short tutorial of how to move through the adaptation workbook, just some screenshots and some hot tips on how to move through, and then we'll remind you of your assignment. Okay, so we actually have in this training 4 different discussion sessions, and each of the discussion sessions are purposely grouping projects by region. So we have folks from the Midwest, we have grouped together, we have folks from the Mid-Atlantic and Ohio, Central Apps sort of grouped together, and then we have a great partly New York and New England contingency. And then there's all these other really awesome folks who decided to take the training with us, folks from Canada, folks from down south and out west. So you can see the distribution of projects and just the sheer volume of interest by region. So we're super proud to have all of you here today, and we're really hoping that we can help you in your climate adaptation planning journey. As you have picked up in some of our materials, we do have a lot of information for the Midwest and Northeast regions, that 20-state footprint, but we have created huge lists of resources to help pull together similar science-based information for all of the other regions as well. So, but I've emailed many of you, so you are aware of that, but just to give you a heads up that some of this is a little bit more independent study for some of the folks outside of the region. It'll be a little bit easier, and you'll see why in the following slides for those in the Midwest and Northeast. Okay, so we were so happy to have you in the discussion sessions, and in one of those activities, the activity was describing your project in 3 words. And so I actually went through the homeworks, because with all of each week as we're going through the adaptation workbook, we're also completing a small homework section after. words. And in week 1, it was kind of a much longer homework section than it is in other weeks. This week, we had you describe your goals and objectives in like a pithy little statement, and they were awesome. We had you rate your pre-training knowledge and familiarity on several different concepts. And that's something that we'll only do twice. So in the beginning of the training and then at the end. And then I'll show you a comparison of maybe how some of those answers changed over time. You described topics that you were most interested to learn in this training, and I'm still going through those, and we'll help to reach out to folks if there's really specific topics, but it looked like broad brush will be able to meet most of those needs. And finally, you shared your 3 keywords and described your project, which again was something we also did in the activity. This is a reminder for folks who have not completed your homework yet. Please do that. This is something you can do at any time as you're moving through the workbook. If you do not see a homework button, then you need to let me know so I can make sure to put your project inside the training. But as you can see, the 3 keywords are really diverse. They're like wide. They incorporate so many different perspectives and values. And yeah, we're really excited to see all of these projects take flight and to hear about your adaptation plans at the end of the training. So thank you so much. Maddie?
All right, great. Well, yeah, it was definitely fantastic last week in our discussion sessions to hear a little bit more about everyone's project areas and talk through those goals and objectives. They're also looking like they're really coming together when we peruse through everyone's homework sections. So yeah, that is step 1, is officially entering our rear view, although it's totally okay. I know some folks reached out today and are still wanting to refine those goals and objectives a little bit today and early this week, and that's great. We want you to be able to continue to do that this week. But we are really moving into this step 2 now, which is to assess climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for your area of interest. And like Danielle said, we're going to go through a lot of the resources to plug into this step this week. So our key questions with step 2 are: what climate change impacts and vulnerabilities are most important at your project area? And then we're also going to talk about how to understand how vulnerable your project area is to those anticipated climate change impacts. And so the first thing that we are asking you to do in step 2 is going to be to really explore that regional scale climate information. So you really want to cast more of a broad net and kind of learn about all of the general trends and impacts that you can expect based on your location. And then after you've done that, the idea is to really think about those site-specific impacts. So we want you to use your familiarity with your site to think about how those broader regional trends that you've learned about can be expected to play out on the site level. And this leap can sometimes be a difficult one to make. So it's just important, we like to remind everyone that there really is inherently some uncertainty in this process for everybody. So, there's really only so far that climate models can take us in terms of downscaling to understand those site-specific impacts. But we don't want that uncertainty to be a barrier to action, right? So this is still a very, very valuable exercise, even if we do end up needing to kind of make some assumptions. And so to do all this, we're going to need some tools and resources. And there really are a wide variety of resources available. But we don't want you to be overwhelmed. So we totally encourage you to go down the rabbit hole this week and absorb as much information as you can. But we've also done the work of compiling a lot of that relevant information for each region for you. So we're going to go ahead and share that. So we have a whole host of resources for our key regions, which you can browse by visiting forestadaptation.org/ecosystem vulnerability. And so here you'll be able to select your region from the ones that you see here. And for each of these, we have extensive vulnerability assessments published, as well as different impact lists and videos. and list that summarized tree species projected habitat suitability as well. And then each of these regions also you'll find has a few different unique resources associated with them. So for instance, we have some climate change field guides for the Northwoods, and we have some story maps in the case of New England and the Central Appalachians. So those are some nice illustrative story maps that you can click through that kind of summarize the information from the vulnerability assessments. And yeah, some other unique resources for each region. But the key resource we have for each of those regions is the forest ecosystem vulnerability assessments. And so these are essentially, they're longer assessments that have been co-created by an expert panel of both researchers and natural resource professionals that came together to go through a formal process to assess the vulnerability of major forest ecosystems in each region. And so they examine a wide range of future climates and really dig into those key ecosystem vulnerabilities. It's important to note this vulnerability assessment does not make recommendations or really get into changes in management, land use, or policy. It's really, again, just a tool that you can then use to inform your management decision. And another resource that you might have stumbled upon already when you've been working on adaptationworkbook.org is the Climate Impact Explorer tool, which you can see here on the left. And so with this Climate Impact Explorer, you can navigate to your region, click on it, and then read a set of impact statements that provide brief summaries from larger published reports, each of which are cited for the different impact statements. And so for, again, the states kind of in our main footprint that you see here in green, the summary statements from the Climate Impact Explorer are actually integrated into the Adaptation Workbook platform already. So when you're going through your homework, you'll be able to select your area and see these different impact statements pop up. And you'll be able to associate the ones that you see as most important with your project really easily. And again, if you're in, so those impact statements will pop up for all across the country when you're in the Climate Impact Explorer. You can click anywhere, but for, again, our footprint in the Midwest and Northeast, they'll also kind of take a deeper look at impacts for individual forest types as well. So in addition to those broader regional climate trends, you'll also have some of these statements that you see here that are going to be, yeah, really taking a closer look at individual forest types. And for those of you who are not in the Midwest and Northeast, you will still have some pre-populated statements in the adaptation workbook that are based on information from the National Climate Assessment summaries. But you are also going to be able to create some customized additional climate impacts. And so, yeah, you'll be able to type things in yourself into the adaptation workbook. And we still wanted to, though, provide you with some a compilation of resources to be able to draw from. So we've created some short resource lists for folks outside of our region. And so here's a screenshot of one for the Southwest. We also have these pages for the Canadian Eastern Provinces, the Pacific Northwest, and other regions. But yeah, these pages are all linked in the training syllabus. So we definitely, yeah, encourage you to check those out and peruse the different resources that are linked there. We also have climate change vulnerability information for urban areas. And so here you can see on this map, all of the different urban areas that we have worked with or created some kind of resource, whether it's a really in-depth vulnerability assessment pictured here on the left for the Chicago wilderness region, but we also do some tree species, projected habitat suitability, handouts for other regions as well. And then step 2 is also a really perfect time to be making sure that you're exploring any of the environmental justice dimensions of your project. And so, yeah, we encourage you to ask yourself which climate impacts are most likely to affect your region and specific project area, and consider how this may affect the human communities that are present. And are there certain people, cultures, economies, assets, et cetera, that are differently affected by outcomes at your project area? And so this is obviously going to be something that gets really hyper local for each of you. And so these might be questions that you need to work on answering by reaching out within your network and community. But there are also some really great resources to at least get started thinking about the big picture. So here we've included the National Climate Assessment, which has some chapters, some broader chapters on like tribes and indigenous peoples and human health, but also each regional chapter. So there's a regional chapter for like the Northeast, Midwest, Southeast, et cetera. Each of those regional chapters also has this kind of drop-down menu you see on the right here that has a human health dimension as well. So those are a really fantastic resource. They do a really good job of looking at the intersection of the climate changes that they're providing an overview of with our human communities. And then there's also this climate mapping for resilience and adaptation tool. So this allows you to view some real-time maps showing where climate-related hazards are occurring right now, as well as projections and projections about exposure to common climate-related hazards moving forward in time. And we'll make sure that all of these resources are included in the follow-up newsletter as well. Okay, and just to wrap up this resources section, we reminded everybody in discussion sessions last week as well, but we do have this special session coming up this Wednesday on the Climate Change Tree Atlas. And again, this is a tool developed by the Landscape Change Research Group with the Forest Service Northern Research Station. And they'll be presenting on Wednesday along with Courtney Peterson from our team. So I know a lot of you are already planning on attending that. Be ready to learn about what the Tree Atlas is all about, or if you've used it before, definitely bring any more in-depth questions that you have, because it will be a great time to dig into those. All right, so hopefully all of those resources get you eager about jumping into step 2 and thinking about those broader climate impacts. But again, after you absorb all that information, really the task is to then think about climate impacts at the site level. So let's talk about how to frame the way that we're thinking about that site level vulnerability in some more detail. So first, we define vulnerability as the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So here's a visual of how we really like to conceive of thinking about that overall vulnerability of a site. So we break it down into 2 parts: potential impacts and adaptive capacity. So the potential impact of climate change can be thought of as a combination of the exposure to changes, as well as the sensitivity of the system to those changes. So here we're really thinking about what the system's being exposed to in terms of changes in temperature, rainfall, storms, changes in dominant species and other stressors, and then again, how sensitive the system is to those changes. And we're really wanting to get at the degree to which those impacts are likely to either support or disrupt the health and function of the ecosystem. So for example, you might have 2 forests that are exposed to 3 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. But in this case, an alpine forest of spruce trees is going to be more sensitive to that change than a forest of oak trees. Then along with potential impacts, we consider the adaptive capacity, or how well the system can cope with potential impacts. Another way of thinking about this is essentially how resilient is the system. And it's important to note that when we think about adaptive capacity, in this context, we're also, assuming no change in management intervention. So we're wanting to think about this right now under current conditions. What is the adaptive capacity of the system? And so here as an example, we have a forest containing many species, or having great species diversity, may have greater capacity to adapt to warming than a forest containing one species, which, as you can imagine, greater species diversity allows for that system to have more adaptation pathways in the face of warming temperatures. So here is kind of where it all comes together, and we can see what all those different kinds of considerations are that go into potential impacts and adaptive capacity. So we are, again, thinking about temperature, precipitation, stressors, key species, and major drivers of change going into that potential impact spin. And then for adaptive capacity, we might be thinking about different species tolerances or plasticity, diversity, and different ways a system might be responding to disturbance. So just to kind of now move out of this conceptual space and ground it a bit more into reality, Danielle is going to walk us through an example.
All right. Thanks, Maddie. Some of that information, especially if you haven't gone through it before, it's really helpful to see it all laid out in that same flowchart manner that Maddie just showed. So I'll simulate the same type of thinking, Maddie, if you go back one slide, with this example as well. So I'll make sure to highlight this idea of when we're evaluating vulnerability, really pointing out that when we think of vulnerability, and some people will just say, oh, that place is vulnerable, but you have to sort of peel apart this idea of vulnerability, because it really is two huge, very different ideas. So we're asking you, as you're thinking about climate change impacts, to maybe even get some scrap paper and write it out in a similar fashion. What are those major climate change impacts that are projected to affect, and you believe, based on your topographic relief and just that inherent buffering of your place, what are those top climate change impacts that are really driving you nuts? Those are the ones that you feel like are going to hit the hardest. And then take a really good look at your place. Think about your forest, think about your ecosystem, your past land management, and evaluate that adaptive capacity. This is, again, that ability to cope with those changes over time. So didn't want to cruise by that too quickly, and really wanted to cement that these are two very different ideas that do come together to form this idea of vulnerability. Okay, next slide. Let's get into that example. So this is a great example. We had, like many of you, somebody come to the training, a training just like this, but a long time ago. And they were Notch View Reservation. This is a group, an organization called the Trustees, located in Massachusetts. And so they went through this adaptation workbook. They thought about their place, and then they helped to devise an adaptation plan, and we're featuring it on our website. And I'll share the link in the chat so you can follow up on it as well. Well, to give a little background on this project, it is in Massachusetts, and it's a pretty huge parcel, right? 3,000 acres of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and other types of habitat. It's pretty notable because it is a huge chunk of unfragmented forests, right? So we know it carries, especially in certain places that have fragmentation issues, this is going to be a really critical habitat zone for wildlife, especially birds, and it is at a higher elevation at 2,000 feet. So it does actually experience a different climate than maybe some of the neighboring lands, in that this place does stay colder than other adjacent areas. So it's been able to been able to hold on to a certain type of forest type that is not necessarily common everywhere, a boreal ecosystem type. But it is just a pretty great place. It has wetlands, beavers, forest seeps. It sounds wonderful. So their management goals are pretty are probably really similar to many of yours. You know, it's thinking about not only preserving this awesome place, but allowing it to also be a great place that other people can visit and experience through recreation and through wildlife experiences, right? So they have not only forest specific stewardship goals, but they also have recreation and wildlife goals. This is a land trust, so they actually didn't come up with that on the ground plan themselves. They did hire a consulting forester to give that perspective and to really give the technical expertise. So just putting that out there if any of you feel like you're in a similar position. Okay, so their major goals are again to designate areas that can help to enhance that forest structure over time and help fight off pests like emerald ash borer and other forest pests that are affecting places in Massachusetts. Okay, next slide. So without going into a ton of details, the link in the chat does provide many more, descriptive words about climate change impacts and the challenges that they feel like would sort of ripple out from those different climate change impacts. But when they're thinking about just that place, a higher elevation place that has a really unique forest ecosystem, they were thinking about climate change impacts in that temperature change was going to be one of the ones that was really on their mind. This place would experience a change in temperature that it definitely had not experienced in the past. In addition, extreme rain and wind and ice storms might become a recurring issue that could have really severe outcomes on this really great place. They also know that this is a special place, very unique in the area. So it actually has really unique ecosystem types that are not probably at their southern edge. So the boreal species, spruce, are already kind of vulnerable because, again, it's at the southern edge of its habitat range. And so with climate change, that is a likely risk, is that this forest could experience additional forest health issues over time. Adaptive capacity, they were thinking about how well can the forest itself cope with those stresses over time. Well, we know there's already invasive plant issues. We know that emerald ash borer and other types of forest pests are either present or are knocking on their door, and they already have deer browse issues. So they know that there are definitely some cards that are, I don't know the metaphor, stacked against them, but the forest is already reeling with several different forest health impacts. And so if climate change was an additional pressure on the system, it really might not be able to bounce back as quickly. So next slide. When they summed up and they did sort of a balance sheet of thinking about climate change impacts and thinking about how well the forest could cope with those changes over time, thinking really long out, right? End of century here. They looked at those forest types, they looked at that habitat projection and that likelihood of the species being able to cope, being capable of coping with those stresses over time, and found that spruce fir was on the list of species that might really experience some tremendous changes in its typical habitat regime and is highly vulnerable. So they thought about that forest as being highly vulnerable, something they were going to have to target when they thought about adaptation. But the neighboring woods within this area, the northern hardwoods, they were finding, looking at each of the different species, that it was moderately high, and they felt like they had a chance, but they knew they were really going to have to focus on regeneration. As they were already experiencing regeneration issues. And so that was going to become a focal point for them in their adaptation. So as you can tell, even in my description, I'm talking about their responses, right? So this is a great opportunity for you when you're thinking about your place, you're starting to assess how climate change will play out in your place. If you have some light bulb moments, you can write them down as far as how you might respond to those stressors over time. This is not necessarily when we're going to incorporate adaptation ideas in step 2, but it will come in step 4. So write the ideas down or jump ahead and get them down. That's totally okay. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to bounce into thinking about the adaptation workbook and how you might experience going through the adaptation workbook. So that was your example. check out the link that I provided in the chat to really chew on that idea, or go to our website and find a regionally appropriate example. We've got a ton of them, filter by topic area, whatever is of interest to you. We have that demo library. We've created it so that you can learn from it in order to, enhance your own learning or perspective when you're thinking about adaptation and going through adaptation planning. Now, when you're starting this process, so you'll leave today, you'll be like, oh, I'm so ready to do this. I've been thinking about climate change just based on the proposals that all of you put forth to us. I know that you've already been thinking about climate change in a really, intentional way, which is awesome. I feel like every year we do this, like the group just gets stronger on the topic and you can really hit the ground running. So many of you probably you've already been keyed in and you're thinking about, these topic climate change impacts are really going to affect my place. Well, you will go to the adaptation workbook, you'll open up step 2, and you will find, it's hard to see right now, I should have created a slide before this. It's a long list of climate change impacts. You can start, you'll only see a bold statement and you'll be like, well, that doesn't give me a lot of information. I want to know, cite your source. I want to see where this is coming from. So what you can do is you can click this little I that's shown here. The arrow is pointing to a little circle with an I in it, the letter I. And a pop-up will appear that includes that bold statement. Temperatures in the Southwest are projected to increase by 3.7 to 8.6 degrees. And then you'll see all the supporting information. So you can go through each of these climate change impacts and you can say, well, okay, yeah, that's going to have an effect for me. I'll leave it. But you might get to one, let's say there's a sea level rise one and you're definitely an interior project and it's not going to be part of your equation. You can go over to the right, you'll see an X, and you just X out, and it's off of your list, your short list of climate change impacts, okay? You can get it back if you've messed up and you come back and you're like, no, sea level rise is important. I want it back. And there's an add button. Okay, so this is how you're first going to create your hit list of climate change impacts of greatest concern. You're going to browse all the impacts, read about them, and then you're going to get rid of the ones that just are not part of your story. Next slide. But the work's not done. So now you've got your simplified list. You're like, this list of climate change impacts really tells the story of climate change impacts that are going to have a huge impact on my place. Well, you could leave it like that and it'll just be incorporated into your plan. But we would then follow up with you and say, can you give us some more explanation as to why that regional climate change impact is important to you? And so what you'll do is you'll click the gray button and that white box will appear. And it will ask you, can you describe why this climate change impact is of concern for your place? And so that's where you'll write down some note about your place. So in this instance, it says, this site the overall climate change impact is temperatures in the Southwest are projected to increase by 3.7 degrees. How might this affect your property or project area? The answer shown here is that this site is heavily shaded and on a north-facing slope. It's less susceptible to temperature increases. It's important to have that climate change impact in your plan because everyone's going to be wondering, why didn't you consider temperature? But then you get an opportunity to state why you're not really thinking that one is going to be of greatest concern for your site, just using this example. So you'll click on the bubble icon there in order to have that box appear so that you can describe how your site may be uniquely affected by climate change. Next slide. And the last thing you're going to do here on the bottom of that one screen, we're only in this one screen view right now, the adaptation workbook. There's an orange button that says add a regional climate change impact way at the bottom. So you'll have looked at your climate change impacts and you're like, hey, nobody's talking about this climate change impact that's super important to me. I have a publication. I know it's important. I've read the science on it. So we would invite you to add your own regional climate change impact statement. This is a statement that will appear only in your adaptation plan. And so if it adds to your story, then we want you to have an opportunity to tell that. So what you can do is you'll paste in your own synthesized statement, whatever it may be. You'll include an additional longer form, idea behind that in that second box. and then you'll have to link to it. So whatever the resource is, we want you to link to it. I think you probably can save it without linking, but it's really important that you do, and then it'll show up in your reference library at the end of your adaptation plan. Okay. So you've gone through your adaptation, or your climate change impacts, that's step 2.1. You've thought about those site level considerations. Now there's like another screen that you'll hit in the workbook where you have to determine vulnerability. What you'll see are some sliders, and the sliders are broken up into those two huge ideas: climate change impacts, potential impacts, and adaptive capacity. For those who have maybe selected a preformed forest type like spruce fir, you might see that those buttons are already pre-registered. They're not just in mixed neutral. And that's because it comes from that climate change vulnerability assessment, the best available peer-reviewed information. We've sort of, based on expert elicitation, we've come up with a vulnerability determination for those species. So in this case, it's disruptive or whatever. You can move it. You can say, well, sure, that might be the regional projection for the species, but not on my property. And you can move it around. That's totally up to you. This is your story. So take that time to really tell your story here. Move those buttons so that potential impacts reflects, the severity of the climate change effects that you are thinking will play out on your place, and then thinking about that ability of your ecosystem to cope with those impacts over time. By doing that, next slide, it will move a little dot around this matrix that will establish vulnerability. And so by making that calculation, it will tell you how vulnerable your site is: high, moderate, or low. That's based on the axes of adaptive capacity and potential impacts. And so we'll ask you to determine vulnerability with those sliders for each of your topic area. If you separated your project out into major ideas or themes, you'll have to do this each time. But hopefully you'll have a really good understanding of the potential impacts and adaptive capacity enough that it'll be very quick exercise for you. Okay, next slide. Sort of to cap up the discussion today, we've launched a ton of information into your lab. I was telling you a while ago, really check out that training syllabus, because I wanted you to see what was ahead for you this week. You'll notice the related resources. It's a long list. You can pick and choose what makes sense to you, but we did just wanted to put the best information in front of you. We are giving you a lot of information without telling you what to do. And that's because we want you in the driver's seat. You are the person in charge. You're the person authoring this plan. You're the person who cares about that place the most. So you need to use your expertise and judgment based on your knowledge of the site, or if you can get someone to go walk the site, or even looking at aerial photography, maybe you can pick up some additional details. But this is really your story to tell. This is your adaptation plan. So don't feel like too, unmoored. Make sure that you're really relying on your expertise and judgment, because you do have a really good understanding, and we want to empower you to make those decisions on your own. Next slide. This is just a reminder to say that, right now you'll be connecting the dots. You'll be really thinking about your place, and it might creep into your brain management and what you're trying to do. And I would say, hold up. We're looking at your place like we're just reviewing a set of maps. We're only thinking about the place, where you drop the pin, what's your geography, what's the past land use. We're not incorporating our management goals and objectives yet, because that's something that we'll do next week. Okay, so this is where you just get to tell the story about this place in this landscape and potential vulnerabilities due to climate change. So we'll discourage you from jumping too far ahead right now. Really focus on those, how climate change will affect the biological components of the site and those ecosystem processes. How well will that ecosystem be able to produce any of those cultural or ecological benefits that you so rely on, like water or different medicines found at the site? Really think about that project location and how its ability to cope with stress and strain over time. In step 3 next week, that's where we will combine step 1 and 2 together to get to management challenges. Okay. So stick to what you know. I guess to sum up my long ramble about the adaptation workbook, you will see a list of climate change impacts that are preloaded based on where you've dropped your pin. Remember that you can remove any with that X symbol. You don't have to keep them, but you can add them back if you need to. We do really want you to get specific and describe how that climate change impact will affect your project area. Again, thinking about that local biogeophysical characteristics. You can add your own custom impact, but make sure you have your citations. And if you need a more thorough walkthrough, remember we have those recorded tutorials, and we also have like a cookbook that's linked in the newsletter, which is a series of screenshots with helper text. Okay, so our assignments for next time, basically spend a bunch of time really thinking through how climate change will affect your place. What are those key climate change impacts? If you had to have only 5 in your elevator pitch, what would they be, or even 3? How vulnerable is your place? Make sure to follow up with additional resources. If you just want to learn something new or you're not really sure about something, definitely check out the video presentations, or even we have a professional scientific academic publications that you can read, really technical and thorough documentation of these ideas. If you have questions, contact your discussion leads because they can give you a head start on those regionally appropriate resources. If you don't know who those people are, you can email me and I'll forward it on. But definitely complete the step 2 within the adaptation workbook and make sure you complete the homework just so we can make sure we're following your progress throughout. And to the best of your abilities, try to complete this step by Monday. This is going to be one of the ones that will take you the longest amount of time, this one and your adaptation actions. So this will be a more intense week, but next week will not be so intense. Okay, so looking ahead, next slide. Our next lecture is next Monday. That's where we will again combine your goals with your site vulnerability and think about what that means. That's step 3, evaluating your management challenges and opportunities. This week on Wednesday, we have our optional session where we'll learn about the climate change tree atlas. And also you will hear from all of us. We will contact you and ask to schedule a project check-in. This is something that we're trying to do throughout the years. And so each of us have assigned ourselves to each of your projects. And the whole purpose of that is that we can follow your progress throughout. We can be that landing board for you if you have ideas you need to bounce off. But also we would like to, provide that technical one-on-one opportunity for you. So if you're too shy to ask a question in discussion, we hope that you would entertain us with your questions in these project check-ins. We'll have 2 of them throughout the training. So this is one where we'll talk about your goals and your objectives, and step 2, this step, thinking about climate change vulnerability. And we will conduct all of those sessions next week. About 15 minutes long, shouldn't be a huge effort, but you'll have to work with folks to make sure the scheduling lines up because I know we're all quite busy. Okay, one last pitch, next slide, for our upcoming optional session. We'd love to have you there. We will have one of the developers of the Climate Change Atlas, Steve Matthews, who's just a really cool person to talk to. We'll have him and Courtney Peterson, one of our NIAC staff, helping to describe the Climate Change Atlas, not only the tool, but uses in some case studies, which will be really fun. Nice way to learn about that. And you'll also have opportunities to ask questions. So we hope that you do. Okay, and that's all we have for today. So we will all stay here and help to answer any questions you have, but otherwise you are free. So thank you so much for being here today.